I'm going to take the fact that you're still having a conversation is a good sign. I apologize for cutting it off sooner than it might naturally wrap up. What we're going to do at this point is just a very quick round robin sort of summary. What I'm going to ask each group to do, and I'm glad to see here in Billings that you have sort of reconfigured your groups, so you get a little more critical mass for each one of these groups. Chris, our fellow, is in the back of the room. He's got a microphone, and what I'd ask for each of your groups to do is give us a very brief, just a couple of sentences, summary of the top 2 or 3 issues or concerns or themes that came out of your conversation. And again, we'll use that as the basis of some further reflection and comment from the panel. And I think what we'll do is sort of, rather than doing all of the summaries and then all of the reflection, I think what we might do is sort of move one by one so that the panelists don't have to make massive notes about all of your conversations, but they can be a little more organic in that reflection and interaction. So which table would like to go first? Which group would like to go first? So when my classes are silent, I always point out that I can wait longer than they can. There we go.
Okay, so we had a kind of a lively discussion, with these folks at our table, but we did talk about that there's broad general support in the community and among voters for early childhood, so that's an early childhood education, so that's an asset we can build on. We're actually looking forward to the governor maybe having a second term, so it might be easier for him to get something passed, which is hard to do in Montana with the split in the parties. So they don't want to give him a big win here in his first term. So anyway, that might be helpful. But we did talk about some targeted work focused in school districts that have a high percentage of kids in the free and reduced lunch. So that's the population we're most concerned about. And if we could develop some partnerships with Head Start Child Care, the school districts, braid that funding, and develop some programs that really work, that are successful, that don't require us to do the whole school system and the whole state to use as models, that in the next 2 years we could probably start with some of that and bring those people to the table together to figure out how that's going to work with the assets that we have and the funding that we have. And then we had a good idea to next time we have something like Early Edge at the legislature, to create one of those full-page ads with all kinds of prominent people signed on, police officers and doctors and teachers and everyone, to say that we support investments in early childhood education to take care of our kids. And what did you say, Joy, the title you had for this group? Yes for Children. Okay.
So any comments, any reflections from the panelists?
Kelly, thanks. We've talked a lot about, so from inside that classroom out, but Kelly's comments were really focused on, so if we want to move the needle a lot, we want to make some big motion, it is going to take political energy and political strategy, and I would find it difficult to imagine. I can say this because I don't work there once somebody else gets elected. But I would find it difficult to imagine that the governor, if he does get reelected, would not put this back on his agenda. And it will take more than what we were able to accomplish last session in order to move it forward. And the kinds of strategies that you brought up are very good and effective strategies. So there's a big political component involved to move this forward.
Anything else?
Am I on? Can you hear me? We also had a very lively discussion at our table. We started off with talking about critical gaps and challenges. We talked about infrastructure, the lack of space. We talked about compensation as a huge issue, pay, recruitment, and retention, just something that underlies so many of the problems of addressing the issues that we're talking about right now, including the difference in culture, the perception of professionalism with K-12 teachers versus early childhood educators. We talked about the culture of K-12 schools changing to be more inclusive of comprehensive services and the whole family, and we think that Head Start presents a great example for that, and it's an example that can be emulated through the K-12 system. We love the idea of parents being ready for school as well as children being ready for school, and thought that that was a huge underlying issue that needs to be addressed. And we talked about, we thought it was really interesting that 1/3 of Head Start teachers are clinically depressed, the statistic that we heard. And it makes a lot of sense when you think of people who are unable to provide for their own families. They're dealing with very difficult, needy children who they're doing a great job with, but then they also see that those children go back to homes that have big challenges and big problems. We talked a little bit about mental health coaching using technology, and so there's some really exciting things that can be done where the teacher is still the expert and the technology is outside of the classroom, so the mental health assistance is not in the classroom, it's from outside so that the teacher is interacting with the child and is the expert. Really interesting information. And then we finally talked about one thing we'd like policymakers to know and people to know is that there is a bridge between the 4-year degree to the P3 certificate. I don't think a lot of people know that, and that's important for people to understand that we are working on this whole system of elevating the profession systematically. So that was our group.
I have a couple of points to reflect on what you just shared. One of them about looking at the Head Start model about comprehensive services. I was thinking at one point today about transition from Head Start programs to kindergarten and looking at those performance standards in Head Start and thinking about how we teach about that in higher ed and encourage our early childhood professionals to know how to make those transitions happen, and again, building on those Head Start performance standards, which are a standard of excellence, and they are a standard that we need to acknowledge and incorporate into our best practices. So I appreciate that piece of it, because I think that we don't need to reinvent the wheel. We've got systems that are in place that we can really build on. I was also struck by the parents being ready for school, and it reminded me of phrasing that I often use, is that schools need to be ready for children and families as well, and I take that seriously in higher ed, from a preparation standpoint for those working with children birth to 8, but then also our school-based services, but then also educational leadership. And I had mentioned about the real need to engage school leaders, and that to me is a very important part of that process. And then finally, you mentioned something about bridge programs between 4-year institutions and the P3 degree. At our last higher ed consortium meeting, we talked about using some time and effort and some money to be able to produce promotional materials on what is P3, what does that even mean, what are some of those pathways, and what are the opportunities in the state. So just creating consistent messaging so that we not only are dispersing that through our campuses, but our local coalitions have that information so that it's really clear, as Dennis was saying too, that some of the standards and some of these pieces that are put into place are for public preschool programs, but what the benefits of a P3 degree are. So looking at how that can enhance the early primary grade teaching and what's happening already in school. So those are some of the things that I hadn't gotten to mention some of that, but it's helpful that those are some themes that emerge from your group, because those are part of our action plans and our goals for higher ed. So thank you.
I always want to address the compensation issue, so thank you for highlighting that again. And I also want to highlight the piece about families and parents. And in early childhood education, we take that very seriously. Our students have to take a family and community partnerships course. That's part of their coursework, or a family systems course. And I just think that whole piece of of the importance of families understanding the development in the early years that's going on and supporting them in that role and helping our educators, both in the public schools and in early childhood classrooms and programs across the state, understand that as well, is really well taken.
Do we have at least one message that's come in from one of our satellite sites from Havre in this case? And it sounds like some of the issues they were discussing there are along parallel lines. So having enough qualified teachers, and already heard from one of the previous groups concerns about retaining recruiting and retaining teachers. This last conversation or last couple of comments about engaging families as well as students and in sort of the traditional institutions and so forth. Folks in Havre also raised some questions about funding and the responsible parties. And I'd be curious to hear if the panel has any comments. I mean, there's sort of the obvious stakeholders or the obvious policymakers, but thinking about this question of who's responsible and where's the funding come from.
It's the million-dollar question.
Right, right.
If we knew the answer, we probably wouldn't be sitting here,
This is
right?
state government guy.
Yeah, well, and I mean, I don't mean to. I don't mean that to be either sort of a trite question of, putting responsibility on, in the governor's office or those kinds of sort of traditional lines of funding, particularly because I've heard a couple of times through the course of the day this idea of creating greater nimbleness, right? And it does make me wonder about the extent to which that is applicable in terms of funding and in terms of policy development, policy making, and so forth. Or the fact that we're having this conversation, if maybe that's it. Maybe that's the nimbleness, this more inclusive conversation and so forth.
A couple of thoughts. One is, and it's kind of what I spoke about in terms of the development of Chapter 63, the preschool education standards. Let's take lessons that we've learned. Let's take a look at, so we know how schools are funded today, K through 12, and what parts of that are effective and what parts of that are not. I'll just be candid. Most of the general fund dollars, I'll go ahead and say all of the general fund dollars that come from the state that go to a public school can be used at the discretion of the local trustees as they see fit. So if you were going to add funding into the current system, which if you haven't realized it yet, I'm not advocating for, it will just go into that general fund budget and the trustees would do with it as they see fit, which could be all of it to the preschool and not all of it to the preschool program. Some of the typical things about funding in state government is what rarely happens, unfortunately, and Wyoming has an excellent model to do this that doesn't happen so much in Montana, is so let's put the calculators away for a minute and let's talk about what do we think it takes to fund that basic program or maybe a little more than that basic program, and then get our calculators out and talk about, so how much money do we think that's going to be? What happens quite often is, so let's pick a number we think that we can move through the system, some tens of millions of dollars, and then we'll work it backwards. And we'll slice and dice that up, and that's what you get. And one of the things that we heard, and I'm no way being critical of the initiative of the governor. I thought he was courageous in doing what he did. But one of the things that we heard from schools was, we don't think we can do it for that. Mm-hmm. And so if we could take a Wyoming approach to that. The other piece is we would want to do what we could to ensure that we protect what already exists. Because one of the things that we often see is that, well, sure, if you want that, then you give up that. Or you can't have it all, so which one of your children are you going to pick from? And we would want to be careful about that.
And I just want to comment as well about funding is that it's going to take blended funding, and we know that Head Start has excellent programs and comprehensive services. We want to support Head Start programs in being able to continue to do that and to partner with school districts. There are innovative ways that school districts can use some of the money they have to support early childhood programs. I'm not talking as an expert here, but I was on a little rural school board, and there are funds available to do that if a school district chooses to use them that way, and the Board of Trustees chooses to use them that way. And then we have the federal money that comes in for the Child Care Development Fund, which is the only thing that's been funding early childhood workforce development, quality initiatives, child care resource and referral, and all of that in the state of Montana since the act went through. So I think it's really going to take some creative thinking about how we're going to do that. And in every local community, it'll probably look a little differently, but I think that's one of our major challenges.
Let's toss it back out to the group, see if there are other summations, other summaries.
I don't have a summary because our summary's already been given.
Hang on one second, we'll get you a microphone. Yeah, we do. There you go.
Oh, I guess I am elected, okay. One of the things that we may be doing is limiting ourselves on one end and expanding what we're thinking of doing on the other. So in other words, we're looking at outcomes and we're looking at universality of the programs. That's a huge outcome. On the other hand, when we're talking about funding, I hear what everybody's saying, but I'm also, there seems to be an assumption that the funding is governmental funding. Now, I agree that government funding is a lot more stable than foundation funding. But if we could rather pick a specific goal that would lead to the universality or help us get there, and then look at large pocket organizations such as Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation or Ford Foundation or Kresge Foundation, and go for competitive grants that would facilitate pieces of the project. For example, one of the issues across the board is trust. Stars to Quality seems to overcome that trust issue for parents, but the Stars for Trust also has some limitations. It does not involve public schools at this point. It involves some Head Starts, if I remember. Is that correct, Kelly? It involves some Head Start programs. So let's look at a program such as STARS that is totally inclusive. Same quality standards across the board for all organizations. And then look for the funding to support how to make that happen, which would be necessarily short-term, but lead to the long-term goals. Thank you.
All right, at our table, we said, good luck, rest of Montana, we're focusing on Red Lodge. No, what we were basically, we have 3 people from Red Lodge at our table and some other valued friends here. So we kind of went with the comment of we have to start solving the problem a community at a time. And not saying that's going to work for everywhere, because absolutely I would love for the entire state of Montana to be able to have quality care, parent support, and I think we all at this table want that for every child in Montana, for every family in Montana. But are there some things that we can enact in our community that can start to make steps towards that? And so one of the things that we discuss in our community is that we just don't have a great knowledge of what our assets are. We don't have an idea of what kind of childcare is provided in a lot of cases, because a lot of it, as Mike was pointing to before, is family, friends, and neighbor, and it's completely off the radar. So that capacity, we just don't have an idea about, and we don't have an idea of the needs of our community. We have a broad sense, and I think a lot of us can probably speak to it, but when we're really trying to assess, especially our most vulnerable families, are they not accessing childcare because they're working at night and there's nothing in our community that offers childcare then? Are they not able to access Best Beginnings scholarships because there are no providers in our community, or limited number of providers in our community that can access or can accept that? So those kind of figures is, we basically just need to get an idea of what's going on. And that's probably something that, and I know people are asking for data points across the state, and I think Mike asked the question, how many people, kids, families are we really talking about here? We can back out some of that, but I think there's a real big void of people, especially those that fall through the cracks, because they're falling through the cracks for a reason. So in our individual communities, as we go home, that may be useful data and a useful picture for us to try and paint as we're moving forward. And I know one of the things, and I think it was you, Kelly, that pointed this out, is infant care is hard. Kelly and I are both parents. We've got kids that, mine are in the K through 12 system now, and she's got a 3-year-old. And we both were not able, you didn't work, right? With Connor? Oh, you did, okay. Kelly was fortunate enough to be able to find a parent to watch her child when he was young. She's a great, awesome woman, but she's not in the registry, she's not licensed or anything like that, but she's a fantastic woman. And me, I stayed home, so I was completely out of the workforce. And so those are the kind of struggles that I think a lot of our Montanans families are working with. Telling those stories, and I know every single one of you in here has those stories, but telling those stories is going to be key, I think, to really personalizing that data. The data is important, but the stories are important too. And so if we can work to develop that larger picture to be able to present to people, to educate them about, yes, this is why this is important economically and whatnot, and educationally and developmentally, but it's also important because of these stories and because of these people and because of these families. So there you go.
I guess what that brings to mind too a little bit is that importance of those community coalitions and that community work, and how we talk about how valuable that is, because that is that two-way communication back to, they now have a tie back into the state, so we get to hear a little bit about those communities, and that's so valuable, so that information never goes just one way. So, I don't know what more to say to that, other than that just really brought up, wow, those coalitions are big, and can we expand those and keep those sustainable?
And I hear you're starting one in Red Lodge, right? Yes. There you go.
And I would suggest that first step, as part of that community coalition piece, it's developing a plan and conducting a needs assessment. And I wonder, statewide, where the resources are going to be different in all communities, but if we're wanting to really understand the very diverse and unique needs of our state, collecting a snapshot of information with some consistency in some of that needs assessment, kind of interviewing and focus group and survey and all of that, I think that's another place where higher ed can come into play as well, having faculty researchers and graduate students and others who are very invested in contributing to the community. I think about at MSU as a land-grant university that our mission is to provide that service and outreach, and so this is exactly the kind of work that we look to do as faculty, and that's not just unique to MSU, that's across our university system and our community college level and our tribal college level, because we're preparing this workforce, and part of that is understanding who it is that we're serving in our community. So I think that that's another takeaway, is that in conducting a needs assessment, kind of connecting that to the formation of a community coalition, and as Sally pointed out, very importantly, that local coalition then reports back to the state group. How powerful. So then we all really understand what it is we're talking about. We really get to know the needs of our state.
And through the grant, there is financial support for the life of the grant on a yearly basis for those coalitions. So it's a nice piece.
So we've gotten a message in from the Missoula satellite site as well, and one of the issues that they raised, which is a little different than I think most of what we've been talking about so far, shifts the focus from some of the topics we've been discussing to the legislature. And their comment here is that legislators need to be educated on what, quote, high quality is in early childhood education, or what it really is. And experts and professionals in the field have to be consulted and called upon to clarify that. And I'm curious if any of the panelists, and I'll open this up to the wider audience here as well, has any reflection or comment about partly the political climate, not the partisan climate necessarily, but the sort of, and not even the awareness necessarily, but the understanding and mechanisms to enhance understanding and strategies that work in that direction. Yeah.
I hope this speaks a little bit to that, but some of the work that we've been doing in different task forces and coalitions, trying to represent early childhood in realms of, say, Department of Corrections, because we'd like to see Department of Corrections begin to focus on the children of the incarcerated. Because if we don't get in front of that epidemic with our children, we're just creating more customers for Department of Corrections. So where is Department of Corrections in this discussion? Child welfare. Where is child welfare in this discussion? Children who are in an open case have very special needs and can put extreme demands on classrooms. They have very special needs that families can't meet, even foster families are unable to meet. So how do we address those kinds of issues so that all the work that we're doing in early ed can be successful by first addressing some of the trauma and the social and emotional needs these kids present? Because there's a lot of research that says if we can help those kids, we get a huge payoff in public schools. Yes, we want to help all kids, but there is a massive return to get in front of those epidemics.
I would add, politics doesn't just happen every 2 years for 90 days. And so if the intent is to try and influence that process, 90 days, I've just always been amazed that they get as much done as they do get done, party politics aside. There's elections a year from now, and there are candidates running for office, and so those votes matter. And if informing legislators or candidates for office is a strategy that is useful and effective, it needs to be done outside of that session. It needs to happen now. I can't tell you how many times in front of legislative committees or listening to the floor of the House or the Senate, I heard legislators say, when I was walking and campaigning through the neighborhoods, these are the things that I heard. They listen. And so pre-session, post-session, election time, I think that's where this type of effort really needs to take place in order to be effective. Once you hit the session, it's vote counting. It's not informing.
So in our area, we, down actually near where John is at, one of the legislators who is, he chairs the interim committee, appropriations committee for Health and Human Services. And one of my colleagues, who I think is in Missoula, listening in here, worked with a STAR provider down in that area, which is in the Bitterroot Valley near Hamilton, and got him to come and visit her child care, got him to come on Dr. Seuss's birthday or something and read a book with a cat in the hat on to the kids, and had the media there, got his picture in the local paper and all of that. And then had a conversation with him about how STARS impacted her ability to deliver services to those kids in his community, in his district. And then my colleague Lucy knows him socially, and so she talked about our work and so on. It was very helpful when we got to the session, because he actually has an experience. His kids are older, you know, he doesn't have any young kids, so so he has an experience about what is actually going on in the STARS program. He happens to be a moderate Republican, so that's very helpful. So I think we can do that everywhere. We can, but not when they're running. They don't have time when they're running, or certainly not when they're in session. And then we had a summit during this session, and there was a guy, the sheriff from Great Falls there. I can't remember his name, but he is a member of that Fight Crime, Invest in Kids. Bob Edwards. Great guy. What a wonderful spokesperson. Was a Head Start student as a child. And probably one of the more painful things I've ever heard anybody say was that he had, and his mom was a single mom, that he's had most of his Head Start classmates in his jail in Great Falls, and that he has them come in, and they want to be in a particular cell because their dad or their uncle or somebody is also in jail. And so people like him, they know where that trouble begins, and they are way more effective, I think, policy-wise than some of us, because it's a real thing. And those are kids that were just like him, but somehow didn't make it. And we don't want to have another generation of them. So I think cops are great allies, truly, for politics.
Our table had a discussion around everything that has been said today. To wrap it up, it's interesting, especially for myself. I'm part of the early childhood field as executive director of an HRDC, but I'm no longer directly in the realm of early childhood. And what I foresee is what you guys are thinking is a common language may not be a common language for everyone in the state. So you guys use a lot of acronyms, slang, it's just like we have so many different programs. So when I'm doing the weatherization program, overseeing that, they have their language. When I do the youth development program, they have their language. And what's happening here is there is some focus on what can we see as a commonality, but I also believe there's value in seeing what the difference is and to truly listen to those differences. I heard one of the panelists, and I don't know which one it is, so I can't give credit, talking about the landscape. What would be very helpful, I think, is to have some talking points through the state on exactly what is the picture of early childhood for our state. What are all, because I was able to read right here on your agenda all the different committees that are going on and the different entities, but to get into some type of language, you know, what are the different pieces, and doing more of this where everyone's at the table up front. Because I know, and I'm always one to talk about the white elephant in the middle of the room, but I've also heard a lot of discussion on the preschool development grant and this Montana Striving Readers and all those pieces, how Head Start was a part of it and all these meetings. But I can say, I was at a HRDC director meeting and I'd asked what's going on with this early edge, and they weren't sure. We went to our Head Start directors, and prior to that, the Head Start directors, my understanding, had not been totally formed at the association level, and I see some shaking their head. So that needs to be discussed, to continue with the discussion, moving forward as a group and knowing it's okay to have those differences and not being afraid to talk about them, because if in this own room here, and you can watch body language in this because we all have our own different passions around areas, if we can't get to that, what are the main points? If you can't sum it up in 3 points, it's going to be difficult to get it across. And I'm a little bit biased towards the Graduation Matters program, but I'm going to use that as an example. Prior to Great Falls having funding for Graduation Matters, our agency had talked with United Way and the school district, Tom Moore, on our dropout rate. I'd actually went to them because in our assessment, we served over 11,000 people last year in 6 counties. And a few years ago, I could see the number of individuals with high school diplomas was extremely high for the clients receiving our services. That started the discussion towards Graduation Matters. One thing I liked about Graduation Matters, there were 4 quadrants. One quadrant was the community, so they really asked the human service providers what's happening in the community. One was with the business sectors. They had one with the students, and then that way, parents, students, schools, and communities. And they didn't look to meld them all together. They were able to say, look, these are different quadrants. What does each quadrant need? And then come together with your objectives, your initiatives based on those. The other piece, and that'll be my final one, is the discussion on there's enough 4-year-olds to go around. So as an executive director of an HRDC, I just want to put out there, it's not our fear there's not going to be enough 4-year-olds to go around, but we see poverty every day, the front lines of poverty, even more so than what our Head Start program sees. So it's not the fact that we're fearful that those 4-year-olds there's not going to be enough to go around, but that comprehensive service somehow gets tied together, that the schools and the communities work together. It's not enough to have one parent night or the homeless, or so, because we're the ones that get the call for those emergency services. And that's the piece, is once you have access to the child, you have access to the family. And just making sure that comprehensive piece stays in so that the child feels safe at school and at home, and they can have some stability. So that's all.
So two things I need to say before I can leave. Trust me, it's only going to be 2. One is that one of the other gorillas in the room, and we've talked about it, and Libby's done a great job of talking about the compensation issue. I don't think people understand the scale of the compensation issue. I ran the numbers before this last session for to bring all of the to solve the compensation problem in just the Head Start programs in Montana. And using the state average K-12 teacher salary as a benchmark, and dealing with all of so we looked at what it would cost to get the teachers up to snuff, and then we looked at proportional increases for the rest of the staff in the Head Start program statewide. And the number was $24 million for a biennium. So I really, and when I talked to Siri and a few other folks in Helena about that, that number is so large that it's, as Dennis said, people politically tend to fall back and say, okay, what's a number we can get through the legislature? What's a number I can get through this subcommittee? And then back into that. And Dean talked when we were sitting around our table, and we talked about sort of the politics and how we needed to do this and work with the state. And his comment was pretty spot on. And he said, the state's got to have some skin in the game here. We can look at private foundation money. We can look at all kinds of other options. But the reality is the state's going to have to put some skin in the game. particularly because as we move forward with the pre-K development plan, governor's proposal for universal pre-K, all of that stuff moves in the direction inexorably of the state being more of a driver in the early childhood world than they have historically been, because up to now, if you think about it, this state doesn't do a heck of a lot. The federal government pays for Head Start, an early Head Start, and the federal government pays for the vast majority of the child care programs that are subsidized. And so you were to, so the number is big. It's a lot of money, and that money was totally separate and wasn't even engaged in what was going on with the universal preschool program. So the other point that I want to make is that one of the other things we talked about at our table was the notion of, and Kelly talked about it briefly, was the idea of getting the ambient level of understanding of the importance of early childhood up to snuff in the community. And I think that a lot of times many of us live in sort of insulated social context, and everybody I know knows what I know, and they all believe in what I believe because they're the people I hang out with. And but there's a lot of people that don't. And so I think that, as Dennis said, and this is another point that's extremely valid, is when Ron Ely goes to Helena, or when anybody goes to Helena as a legislator, what they remember is what they got told when they were going door to door. And if everybody in the state of Montana, or frankly probably 60% of them, if every time they knocked on a door, what they heard about is, you guys got to get your stuff together on early childhood education and begin to get some serious efforts about coalescing a system-wide approach and putting some money into the process, then it can happen. But I think that I think that the politics of this are not only, and what Lucy did with Ron is really good, and we need to do that kind of politicking too. But I think we need to do it we need to develop the base at the grassroots level. And you know, in our world, we've got, you know, we do a lot of work with families, and we've got families that we can work with. But that's, we need to go beyond that, and the general community in the state needs to be tuned into this, and I think that's when it'll happen. When the grassroots support is broad enough, it'll happen, regardless of what kind of the governor says the sky is blue and the legislature says it's green. We got to get around that.
I think we've got time for maybe one more question. I want to sort of be mindful of the time, and that you guys have been at this for a long while.
Mine's not a question, but more of a comment. And first, I want to preface by saying I think that communication modes have increased networking, collaborating, community coalitions and things. But much like the comment here that, we know what we know in the circles that we know, I'd like to suggest that in some ways the state take another look at how to communicate with more people in different channels, because parents aren't hearing about the initiative, especially poverty level parents. There just have to be different ways for us to begin to communicate. We even have providers that feel disenfranchised because they haven't heard about coalition meetings, and that's not to say that you guys haven't put it out there. It's just, when we hear that there's a challenge, we as a society should say, okay, I'm kind of hurt that you thought I didn't communicate with you when I thought you did, but then step back and go, okay, but obviously I need to find another way to get the message out, and I'd really like us to figure out a way to communicate more effectively in Montana with all Montanans, and give them an opportunity to come to things like town hall meetings, or something. I don't know what it might be, but we've got to have more voices at the table, which frankly will lead to more of the groundswell that I heard a panelist ask for. But we've got to communicate with more people. If we don't communicate and touch their lives, then they not only didn't know the information, at some point they feel disenfranchised because they didn't get the information when they could have helped make a decision. So I don't know how to do it, but I sure would like us to think more about it.
Thank you. It's actually a great sort of summary point, and then it'll segue into a couple of comments I want to make here in a moment. Before I do that, though, I want to thank our last panel this afternoon for their comments, as well as your participation in this last process. As I mentioned earlier, we are hoping to collect your notes from these conversations. So if you'd be willing to share those, we would love to have them. As a sort of logistical process for doing that, there's a box on the corner of the registration table just outside the ballroom here. If you would be willing to drop those notes into that box, we'll collect them. We're going to compile them and kind of organize them by theme or whatever emerges out of that, and have that available following the event. I have the somewhat unenviable or daunting task of trying to figure out how to sum up 12 fairly diverse, interesting sets of comments across 3 panels, a great deal of energy and passion, although it's late in the afternoon, the energy's waning a little bit, understandably. I don't know how many of you remember the Far Side cartoons from back a few years ago. One of my favorite Far Side cartoons was a single pane of a very large boy with a very small head sitting at the front of the classroom with his hand up, and the caption underneath says, "Mr. Osborne, my brain is full. Can I go home now?" And I often reflect at the end of a 3-hour seminar, when I'm teaching graduate students, and they're looking a bit like you do, that sort of, "Mr. Osborne, my brain is full. Can I go home now?" So my task is to figure out how to identify 3 or 4 takeaways that I can somehow sort of shoehorn into your very full brain, that you can take with you, and that continues or hopefully helps spur the continuation of these conversations when you return to your home communities and back to your workplaces. It strikes me as I've been listening to the conversations throughout the course of the day that there are a number of themes that have come up over and over again. And the fact that these have come up over and over again in some ways sort of validates my philosophy of education, which is something along the lines of repetition is good for a developing mind, which I think works really well. And I say this having come out of political science and not out of education. I'm sort of ashamed to acknowledge that I learned my philosophy of education from the cartoon character Jimmy Neutron instead of in education classes. But it works, nevertheless. I think it does work. And that repetition throughout the course of the day seemed to orbit around a couple of different ideas. One of which, it seems to me, it has to do with vision. Right, the notion that there is a shared understanding of the value, of the potential, of the importance of high quality, accessible early childhood education, and the hope and the optimism, not always optimism, and there is obviously a difference between hope and optimism, right? But certainly the hope, and I think often the optimism, about how that might be achieved moving forward, incrementally, though it may be, but achieved nevertheless. I think a similar idea that I've heard, or a notion that I've heard running throughout these conversations, and it's a parallel one to be sure, has to do with commitment. And that, I think, really is about the energy and about the passion and the sustained engagement of all of you and many of your colleagues in focusing on these issues. Those combined, so I guess let me say that a little differently. One of the things that those two issues make very clear is that it is not for lack of effort or energy or concern that you are wrestling with these challenges, right? That capacity is there, and the question then becomes, well, what other capacity needs to be built in order to make further progress? And much of the conversation then of the day has orbited around the notion of capacity, and that may be having to do with teachers and the availability of teachers, the recruiting and training of teachers. It might be about pay. Certainly that has been a recurrent notion. It might be about institutional capacity, communications capacity, the ability, I use the notion, and others have as well, of the idea of nimbleness. I think, that the challenge in some ways is the reverse of that, right? How do we deal with systems that are at least perceived to be rigid or overly rigid in some way? But lots of different questions and concerns associated with capacity. And then a fourth notion that I heard throughout the course of the day, it seemed to me, had to do with integration of all sorts of different systems. And so that might be about the integration of services across different domains and the importance of integrating services and not treating them as if they are sort of atomistic or entirely distinct from each other. The integration of systems as well across agencies and across levels. Integration of institutions, integration within communities, integration in among family members and across families, but integration of all sorts of in all sorts of different forms. So I think about how all of those fit together, or the possibility that they do fit together, what it brings to mind for me is the concept of wicked problems, which I'm not sure you may have encountered in the past, but the notion of wicked problems is one that was developed in the early 1970s by Riddle and Weber. And the idea of wicked problems is that these are problems that are complex enough and integrated enough that, one, there is no permanent fix to them. There's no permanent solution to wicked problems. You can improve conditions, or conditions can become worse, but they're not permanently solved. Moreover, they're not solved by any one individual or any one entity or any one institution. Wicked problems, responding to wicked problems requires an integrated, a comprehensive, a systemic or systematic sort of response. I'm increasingly convinced that the majority of sort of vexing policy issues that we face, this one among them, are very much characterized by the notion of wicked problems. The response then to wicked problems often is the utilization of networks, right? And this is why I suggested that last comment that you made is a perfect segue, because the challenge of networks is how do you coordinate them? Right? You have a whole collection of individuals, organizations, and so forth that are pursuing their own missions, that are pursuing, and I don't use this term in a pejorative way, but pursuing their own interests. And that's the nature of life, I think, broadly, right? That's the case. And so the question then becomes, how do you coordinate the activities of actors and institutions within these networked environments such that you can have a collective impact on the problems that you face? I think this conversation throughout the course of the day, and the call that many of you have issued to focus on communications and continuing the conversation and making sure that the diverse and inclusive voices are present at the table, is exactly the strategy to do that. Much of the work that I do with organizations that are in contentious circumstances or communities that are facing challenging problems is to do exactly that thing. The notion that no one individual, no one policymaker in those environments has sufficient resources or capacity or power to fix the problem on their own. And my job then often becomes, how do you bring to bear the information, the knowledge, the capacity that already exists, and aggregate it in such a way that you can take those next incremental, halting, hopefully larger over time steps forward to respond to those problems. And if there were a call to action at the end of a long conversation today, it seems to me it's that one. It seems to me that that's the place where you've started to work your way through. And I'm happy as a member of the Wheeler Center, as the director of the Wheeler Center, to help along that line. But clearly this is something that you've already been doing. Many of you are already well down that path. And for that I commend you and would just say, keep it up. Continue down that process. Continue to have these conversations. Make sure you have one another's business cards when you walk out of here. And that may be to solve a really concrete policy problem, and it may be to get a recommendation for something that you've tried in the past, and it may just be to commiserate with, man, I tried it again and it still didn't work, right? But that's the communication. And so with that, I'm gonna say thank you for coming out this afternoon, or for today, for spending the time thinking and working through these questions with us. I hope to see many of you again in the future. I'm sure you'll be seeing one another. But again, thank you very much for coming out. One last logistical note before you take off. We, as you know, are videotaping the conference. We're streaming it to Missoula and to Havre. Thanks to those of you who are in Missoula and Havre. Hopefully you stuck around to the end. We will be making this available as a video that you can stream hopefully in the next few weeks or so. So if you'd like to share this with colleagues, please do so. Check out the Wheeler Center's webpage. We'll have information about this event as well as future events later this year and into next year. But look for those videos and please share them with your colleagues. Thanks. Have a safe trip home.